Okay, we're in Daniel chapter 2. So there's two handouts. One of them is just kind of the verse-by-verse summary. This one here is intended to be more of a chart to help you visualize the image and that Nebuchadnezzar sees in his dream. And of course, we don't actually know what he saw, so this particular image I pulled out of a book by a Reverend Larkin that was originally published in, 2000. Let me go back up. Let me get in the right century here. In 1916, and then the particular book I had was a reprinting in 1920. And turns out the same book is still in publication today. But so I contacted the publisher of the book today and checked with them, and they said, if you're pulling that image out of the 1920 book, you're free to do whatever you want with it. So there's what I did with it. Anyhow, I think most of us are quite familiar with the overall story here. And so the attempt of this page here with the image on it is just to provide a graphic that helps you relate what is seen in this vision or dream in chapter 2 to the remainder of the book particularly. Because basically the chapter 2 and what Nebuchadnezzar sees in this dream is or provides an outline for the remainder of the book of Daniel. Okay? Not only does chapter 2 provide an outline for the book of Daniel, but prophetically, this may be the most single important chapter in the entire Bible when it comes to understanding Bible prophecy. Pretty much everything hinges off of this dream that God gives Nebuchadnezzar. So in the various text boxes that I've put there, I've given you some of the verses where the head of gold, where else do we see the head of gold? Where else is it discussed in the book of Daniel? So I gave you some references. Same thing with the silver breast and arms. Where is that discussed? The belly and thighs of bronze. Where else is that discussed? The legs, feet, and toes being the fourth empire. Where else do we see more about that within the book of Daniel? What I hope to do in the future is also widen that out and show you where these same kingdoms come into play in other books, prophetic books of the Bible. And when you get right down to it, we just finished up working our way through the 12 minor prophets. And within those minor prophets, there's a dependency, if you will, or an association at least reflected in those prophecies with Daniel chapter 2. It all ties together. And one of my premises is that if you're going to study Bible prophecy, and if you're going to try to get into a book like the book of Revelation, you really ought to have a handle on Daniel first, okay? Daniel helps us understand a lot of what comes later. Now, on your other notes here, there's a phrase that Jesus uses in Luke 21:24. And you can look at that if you want. So in this passage, Jesus is in what we call the Olivet Discourse. And within that section of the discourse, I'll start reading in verse 23. Woe to those who are pregnant and to those who are nursing babies in those days, for there will be great distress upon the land and wrath to this people. And they will fall by the edge of the sword and will be led captive into all the nations, and Jerusalem will be trampled underfoot by the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled. Okay? And that phrase there, times of the Gentiles, I think is a key phrase in understanding Bible prophecy. And I believe that phrase, properly understood, begins with the captivity of the southern kingdom under Nebuchadnezzar. So when we're in Daniel here in chapter 2 and even chapter 1, we're looking at the beginning of this period of the times of the Gentiles. Why is it the times of the Gentiles? Because, as Jesus describes here, Jerusalem will be trampled underfoot by the Gentiles. In other words, the Gentile nations are in control of Palestine. They're in control of Jerusalem. Now, some people will argue today that the Jews are in control of Jerusalem. Not really, okay? Jerusalem is still divided into different quarters, and there's a large Gentile population within Jerusalem. So I believe that we are still within this period of the times of the Gentiles. There's also another, and I've cited some other passages here that I think help back that up, and perhaps Romans 11:25, Paul, the Apostle Paul, uses a similar thought here. 11:25, for I do not want you, brethren, to be uninformed of this mystery, so that you will not be wise in your own estimation, that a partial hardening has happened to Israel until the fullness of the Gentiles has come in. Okay? Fullness of the Gentiles. Again, I think that ties in with what Jesus is saying over in Luke. But there may be a slight distinction there to reference, and you see that in the next paragraph. Fullness of the Gentiles may not be entirely identical with the times of the Gentiles. The fullness may be completed at the time of the rapture, which many premillennialists have believed precedes the second advent. So the fullness of the Gentiles could be completed when the church is raptured, but nevertheless, we still persist in the times of the Gentiles because Jerusalem remains trodden under the Gentile nations through the tribulation period. Okay? So the completion of the times of the Gentiles is at the second advent. Possibly the completion of the fullness of the Gentiles is at the rapture. Everybody following me on this? Any questions about that? Okay, and that I hope you're referring back to our previous studies in the book of Revelation for support on that. All right, and one other interesting thing I wanted to throw out to maybe bring home the idea that God marks out, He determines certain time periods for groups of peoples and nations. And you see this all the way back in Genesis 15:16. Let me flip back there. The Lord is speaking to Abraham here, and He says in verse 15, as for you, you shall go to your fathers in peace. You shall be buried at a good old age. Then in the fourth generation, they shall return here, for the iniquity of the Amorite is not yet complete. Okay. Well, what's he talking about? Well, this is basically predictive. You know, Abraham, when he was called of God, he came to the land of Palestine. And God promises him possession of that land, but not at that time. It's going to be several generations before that happens. And in the meantime, they're going to wind up in Egypt. The Israelites are going to become enslaved in Egypt, and then God is going to deliver them out of Egypt, and then they're going to come back to the land that God promised, and that's when they're going to take possession of it. And so God has a timetable there. He has a timetable for His nation that He has chosen out, and when He's going to bring them into that promised land. And that timetable is somewhat based, apparently, upon this idea here, for the iniquity of the Amorite is not yet complete. Right? So He's letting the Amorite civilizations there that occupy that land of Canaan a certain amount of latitude, I guess, as far as their iniquity, their sin. That grows to a point, and then God uses Israel to end all of that by the destruction of that Amorite civilization. Now, who are the Amorites there? I got a little bit of a note for you. Let's see, the term Amorites is used in the Bible to refer to highland mountaineers who inhabited the land of Canaan. They are described in Genesis as descendants of Canaan, who was the son of Ham, in Genesis 10:16. And that apparently aligns with Akkadian and Babylonian traditions that equated the Syro-Palestine area with the land of the Amorites. And in the Bible, the term Amorite and Canaanite are sometimes used in an interchangeable sense, right? Now, hey, I've got to pull this one out here. How many of you have ever been asked by someone, well, why did God want his people to go in and basically annihilate an entire race? Doesn't that sound like genocide? Have you ever had somebody ask you that question? Okay. There's a biblical answer for this, right? Turn to Leviticus 18, okay? All right, Leviticus 18. I'm going to read to you from a paraphrased version, but this will shorten it up a little bit and I think kind of drive home the point that's being made here. The Lord then told Moses to tell the people of Israel, I am Jehovah your God, so don't act like heathen, like the people of Egypt where you lived so long, or the people of Canaan where I'm going to take you. You must obey only my laws, and you must carry them out in detail, for I am the Lord your God. If you obey them, you shall live. I am the Lord. None of you shall marry a near relative, for I am the Lord. A girl may not marry her father, nor a son his mother, nor any other of his father's wives, nor his sister or half-sister, whether the daughter of his father or his mother, whether born in the same house or elsewhere. And I'm going to do some skipping here because there's several regulations there that have to do with the marriage of close blood relatives, okay? And the implication is that the Canaanites, the Amorites, they didn't follow these kind of regulations here. So I'm going to skip down to verse 19. There must be no sexual relationship with a woman who is menstruating, nor with anyone else's wife to defile yourself with her. You shall not give any of your children to Molech, burning them upon his altar. Everybody know what that is? The child sacrifice, burning babies alive. Okay? Never profane the name of your God, for I am Jehovah. The next verse, 22. This translation makes it quite clear. Homosexuality is absolutely forbidden, for it is an enormous sin, is how this paraphrase puts it. Some of you probably have something about abomination. A man shall have no sexual intercourse with any female animal, thus defiling himself, and a woman must never give herself to a male animal to mate with it. This is a terrible perversion. Do not defile yourselves in any of these ways, for these are the things the heathen do, and because they do them, I am going to cast them out from the land into which you are going. That entire country is defiled with this kind of activity. That's why I am punishing the people living there and will throw them out of the land. But you must strictly obey all of my laws and ordinances, and you must not do any of these abominable things. These laws apply both to you who are born in the nation of Israel and to foreigners living among you. Does that make it pretty clear? Yeah, okay. Thoughts or comments on any of that? Okay, back to Daniel 2. Yes. Charlotte.
When it says everybody like their servants.
Yes, yeah, it could be, as they went into the land and they conquered certain groups, some of them were allowed, the Israelites allowed to live among them. Some of them were taken as slaves or servants, as you will, not necessarily making what we would call a heartfelt conversion to the God of Israel, right?
Moses' wife.
Yeah, Moses' wife, yeah. Okay, so Daniel chapter 2. So, this happens in what is described as the second year of the reign of Nebuchadnezzar. We think, and I favor this view here, that, and I know Charles had discussed this as part of the introduction, and that is, when was Daniel and his friends taken captive? Okay, and I favor the position that they were probably taken captive in 605 BC, which would mean that this vision that Nebuchadnezzar has probably is in Daniel's third year there, but for Nebuchadnezzar, this is Nebuchadnezzar's second year of reign. And part of that can be reconciled by understanding how the Babylonians would handle a partial year reign versus how Daniel might look at it from a Jewish viewpoint. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on that, but it could be reconciled that way. So anyhow, this is probably in the time frame of, we'll say, around 604 BC. So he had dreams, and the word there is plural, and his spirit was troubled, his sleep left him. It could be that the dream, I would classify the dream as, I think, affecting him like a nightmare, what we would call a nightmare, right? And if it's a truly frightening nightmare, you might be so frightened by it that you don't want to sleep. The fact that the word dream is in the plural may indicate, I believe, that it's a recurrent dream. This happened more than once. He keeps seeing basically the same thing. Some elements of the dream may change a little bit, but I believe he's seeing the same image in each of these dreams that he has. My reasoning for that is that when Daniel and his three friends pray so that they can know what the dream is, and when that revelation is made, and Daniel goes back to Nebuchadnezzar to tell him, he tells them of only one dream. Okay, so there's really only one dream that Nebuchadnezzar is having. All right, and Daniel then offers the interpretation for that. So then we had this discussion between Nebuchadnezzar, the king, and he calls together all of the wise men. If you have, depending on which Bible version you have, you may see some different words there. I think, and I'm not going to go into the detail, you can read the detail there, but I think the overall idea here is that Nebuchadnezzar is so troubled by this that he's summoning together, at least from his viewpoint, any and everybody he can think of that would help him understand what the significance of this is. So he's resorting to, from his perspective, his Babylonian culture, he's resorting to those people that he think could help him understand that. So we have, some versions have like magicians, but the word that's used for magician could actually be equated with a scholar, somebody who's well studied, okay? And they might be studied in astrology and things like that, alchemy, other forms of knowledge. The conjurers or enchanters may be those who were believed they had the power of necromancy, which is the ability to call forth the dead and communicate with them. I think one Bible version, maybe King James, has something like soothsayers. You have sorcerers. These could be, in the NIV and the NA, New American Standard, which I use, both translate this the same, and that would be those who practice sorcery and incantations. And the astrologers or Chaldeans, the terms are basically interchangeable. And so it may refer to a people group in southern Babylonian who assisted Nabopolassar, who is Nebuchadnezzar's father, to defeat the Assyrians and establish the new Babylonian Empire. All right? So it would make a certain amount of sense that these wise men that helped Nebuchadnezzar's father obtain victory, that you would call upon them to come and help you understand what's the significance of this vision or dream. Okay? So I think he's just trying to pull together all the help that he can. Depending on which Bible version you have, some Bible translations make it sound like that Nebuchadnezzar is saying, I've had this terrible dream, but I don't remember it. Other Bible versions, I think, favor the idea that he knows the basic content of the dream, and he may be playing a little coy with them because he doesn't really trust any of these people. He knows that basically the entire group of them, that they're more prone to say what they think will please the king and promote themselves. Right? Makes perfect sense if you're in that kind of position. We have a phrase for them today. We call them brown nosers. Okay? All right. Personally, actually, if you understand what that means, it's not that nice. And if Nebuchadnezzar had actually forgotten the dream, okay, and if these guys had really believed that, then they could have simply fabricated whatever dream they wanted and convinced him that that was his dream and then offered the interpretation for it. But it's obvious that they at least suspect that he knows what his dream is. And so they're very cautious. They're looking out for themselves, and they're saying, we're not going to stick our necks out too far here. And they go so far as to say, what you're asking for, King Nebuchadnezzar, that's never been asked of any king ever before. Right? That's their defense. So I think they're doing the best they can to save their own lives. All right. But the king, he suspects their arguments. He suspects that they're stalling for time, that maybe they want time to come up with some kind of conspiracy to manipulate him through all of this. And it's also kind of amusing that the Chaldeans, in a sense, tacitly admit that they have deceived the king in the past with other interpretations. So that's kind of a little subtle thing there that occurs in the text. Well then, and so Nebuchadnezzar is enraged by all of this, and he starts rounding up. He wants his captain of the guard to start rounding up all of the wise men, all of these guys, and he wants them to be executed. And Daniel and his three friends are going to be caught up in that roundup. And Daniel inquires of this Arioch, okay, what's going on here? And so he's told, and Daniel, in his wisdom, we'll say, as a young man, tactfully approaches this guard and tells him that his God can help him understand what the dream is, the content of the dream, and what the meaning is. And so the first thing that Daniel and his three friends do is they get together and they pray, because they know that they can't do this on their own. They're being faced with the impossible, aren't they? All right. Faced with the impossible. The only answer, the only out they have to preserve their own lives is that God answer their prayer. And so they rightly turn to God to get that information. And God graciously answers. And he tells Daniel, okay, it reveals to Daniel the content of the dream, and then also gives him the interpretation of it. So then, around verses 24 and 25, Daniel goes back to Arioch and tells him, we got the answer here. And Arioch goes to the king, and I think I find it kind of amusing that when Arioch goes back to the king in verse 25, he hurriedly brought Daniel into the king's presence and spoke to him as follows. I have found a man among the exiles from Judah who can make the interpretation known to the king. All right? What's Arioch doing here? Yeah, he's taking credit where credit isn't due. Because after all, Arioch didn't find Daniel. If you read this right, Daniel found him. Right? Okay? Daniel approached him. Okay? And I think that plays into us understanding a little more about the character of Daniel. In fact, in the notes there, let's see, in verses 24 through 30, on the back side of the notes there, I list several things about Daniel that strikes me, and you might come up with some others, but I wanted to be sure and have some time for application here. That is, first off, Daniel pleads for the lives of all of those wise men, interceding on their behalf before Arioch. Now, that's quite generous on Daniel's part, isn't it? Because, basically from Daniel's viewpoint, all of these other men are charlatans. Okay? They're all fakes. They're all forgeries. Right? Nevertheless, he graciously pleads on their behalf. Secondly, he makes no attempt to challenge Arioch for taking at least partial credit for finding Daniel. Daniel just lets it slide. Right? That's an issue of character there. Thirdly, Daniel approaches the king with the reverence and fear that's due him. And I cite Romans 13, 1 through 7 there. This is an official. Daniel recognizes that Nebuchadnezzar is in his position as king because God appointed him to that. Okay? And he gives him the deference that he should. Then, fourthly, Daniel boldly proclaims the source of his wisdom as being from the God in heaven, not missing a clear opportunity, and put it in our terminology today, to preach the gospel. Okay? He lays it out to the king. And he does so with boldness in doing that. Yet at the same time, he does that. He is bold, but he's tactful in doing it. And then, fifthly, Daniel takes no credit for himself. And he exhibits no effort whatsoever at self-promotion. He gives all the glory to God. And he makes it absolutely clear that he, Daniel, is not the one who possesses the inherent power or capability to have done this. Only God could do it. George?
I kind of wonder that Arioch taking partial credit for finding Daniel. Arioch was set out to gather up all these guys so that they could be executed.
Mm-hmm.
But if Daniel doesn't follow through, what's going to happen to Arioch?
If Daniel doesn't follow through with the answer, oh, okay, yeah, good point, yeah, okay.
He's kind of tied.
So Arioch's sticking his own neck out there a little bit, is what you're saying.
Right.
Yeah, I agree with that, yes. And that might indicate there might be some kind of relationship between Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego with Arioch, where he would respect them enough to actually do that for them. Yes, so that's a good point. Was there anybody else had a point? Okay. All right, so then we get into the image. And you have the description of the image, breaks down into the 4 different kingdoms. I'll let you just study the chart in regards to that, and then the interpretation, okay? And the primary principle here is that we always follow this principle, let Scripture interpret Scripture, okay? So what is the significance of the symbolism of Nebuchadnezzar's dream? You're given the answer right here, okay? We don't have to go any farther than right here. We don't have to use human wisdom to figure any of this out. So the image represents symbolically the succession of the Gentile kingdoms that would not only rule over a large portion of the civilized world, but particularly would also rule over Palestine and the people of Israel. Because, at this time, geographically, we know that often China, there's other empires going on, different parts of the world. Here in the Americas, Indian groups, things like that. Okay. But these are selected because they are the ones that all have a part in ruling over the Israelites. Okay. The term God of heaven is used here. Daniel likes that one. It's used several other times in the Old Testament. The implication of that is that this is the God that rules over the heaven from which the Babylonians, the Assyrians, the Persians, the Medes, and everybody else thought a bunch of gods lived. Okay? This is the God who created that, who rules over it. Okay? If there are any other gods, they're all submissive to him. In verses 46 through 49, God is referred to as, Nebuchadnezzar's response to all of this is that God is, the God that Daniel worships is the God of gods and the Lord of kings. That's quite an admission. Quite an admission. Based on the context of the book, I don't think that means that Nebuchadnezzar suddenly becomes a believer. Because next week when we get to chapter 3, you're going to see what happens with Nebuchadnezzar I think as a result of this dream of this statue. You get in chapter 3, and the next thing you know, he's building some giant statue, and he wants everybody to worship it, right? And I'm pretty sure that he sees that statue that he has built as a manifestation of himself. So he hasn't gotten the message yet. All right. Can I answer any questions at this point? Because we haven't read through the text, and hopefully you've taken the time to do that. Is there any confusion on your part about any of this? I think the most confusing part about the whole thing is when you get down to the feet and the toes, and the 10 toes, and the mixture of iron and clay. Okay? If, at least according to one of the books by Walvard from Dallas Seminary that I have, he says that if you took iron and clay and smelted that, heated it up, and then poured them into a mold and allowed them to cool, the clay would still not bind with the iron. And if you took a hammer and struck that or something like that, the clay would actually still separate from the iron, right? So there's a lot of questions about what is the symbolism of the iron and the clay not binding, and what is the symbolism of the 10 toes, right? Personally, and I think most of us would agree here, and especially as we've gone through the book of Revelation, I think the 10 toes relate to the 10 kings and horns that are discussed in the book of Revelation. So they're still future, even from the time that John writes the book of Revelation, right? One other point I'll throw out here, and it's interesting that in Daniel, as Daniel offers the interpretation of the dream, okay, he specifies the first part of the image, the head of gold. That's you, Nebuchadnezzar. That's Babylon. The arms, the 2 arms and the chest. Interesting that the 2 arms could represent the Medes and the Persians. Daniel, again, later on in the book, specifies that's the Medes and the Persians. Okay? The third part of the image, the belly, the thighs. Okay? Again, Daniel specifies that's Greece. Okay? But when it gets to the fourth part of the image, Daniel never says specifically who or what that is, right? Now, at the book of Daniel, was a second century BC or even second century AD forgery, all right? Somebody pretending to write the book then and pretending to be Daniel. By second century BC, all the way into second century AD, who's in charge? The Romans, okay? If you're writing a forgery, if you were the forger, why wouldn't you go ahead and say, this is Rome? Okay? But Daniel, if he's writing this back around, we'll say 550 BC, some round number, okay? If he's writing this actually back then, he doesn't name Rome. I think that's kind of interesting and something another argument we can throw into when was this book actually authored. All right, we'll close on this at the bottom of the notes there. Evidences for a premillennial interpretation of this book. Okay, premillennial. Remember, that's basically our position here, that Jesus Christ must return to establish the millennium. And when he returns, that'll be at the end of that period of tribulation, and that he himself ushers in that millennial kingdom. And these are all suggested by Walvoord. The first one is that the stone cut without hands is not something that happens gradually, because in Daniel's description here, that stone is cut out without hands, and then it's hurled against the feet of the image. That's the weakest part of the image, right? And the entire image crumbles before it becomes like chaff that's blown away in the wind, right? That's all rather sudden. And then the kingdom that follows that, okay, appears after that stone comes on the scene, okay? So it's not, the idea then is that some would interpret the stone, like an amillennial view, might interpret the stone as being the church, okay? And that as the church grows and as it evangelizes the world, then it is that stone that is gradually subduing all of these other kingdoms. But that's not the way Daniel describes it, is it? Okay? Christ, who we believe is a stone, and there's plenty of scriptural support for associating him with the stone, does not destroy the fourth empire during his life on earth. Okay? And also during that same time when Jesus was on earth, there are no 10 concurrent rulers among the Romans. 10 concurrent. Okay? Though Christ is a stone and the cornerstone of the church, he is presently not, nor during his time on earth, a smiting or destroying stone, as described by Daniel. The stone is going to destroy all the previous kingdoms. The church doesn't have any such role, do we? Are we out there today destroying kingdoms? No, we're not destroying the kingdoms. We're preaching the gospel. Okay? And then lastly, Christ returns to earth to establish his kingdom. In other words, if Christ is a stone, and we couple that with Revelation, what we see in Revelation, Christ himself returns to establish that final kingdom. Okay? All of that fits into the premillennial interpretation instead of the amillennial or the postmillennial interpretation. All right, covered a lot of ground right there, but that's something for you to chew on. Pretty much out of time, but I'll take one question if there is one. Okay, Jake.
So this here, I guess the two legs is the Eastern and Western Roman Empire when they split, I guess?
Yeah, I left that on that image. Remember, I copied that image, and so the dispensational writer that I borrowed that from, that was his view. If you notice on the picture, I put 2 question marks there, okay? I do that because Daniel never specifies that in his explanation. So if we're going to say that represents the Eastern and Western church of the empire later on in Roman history, that's kind of our taking history and trying to apply it as a means of interpreting that image, okay? So I do that with reservation. Okay? All right, let's close in prayer. Father, thank you again for the power and testimony of your word. And we just ask, Father, that you continue to grant us clarity of understanding as you did to Daniel and his friends. And we do this, Father, not so that we can just spout off prophetic knowledge, but rather that we understand how sovereign you are over the affairs of mankind. You lay out the times, the seasons, the destiny of each and every nation, each and every ruler. They are all under your sovereign control. And that's the confidence that we need today, Father, when we certainly look at our own nation and wonder what's going on here. So we just pray that you'll build our confidence in your sovereignty. And we ask this in Jesus' name.